tonight by asking this question: how do you know if someone is a Christian? Is it because of the cross on their t-shirt? Or is it because of the fish on their bumper? How do we know? We can all respond and say, only God knows the heart, and that is true. But how can we know if anyone is a believer? How can we do church discipline if we really don't know and only God knows the heart? Well, church discipline is an action that's based upon the profession of the individual. The individual says, I am a believer, but he is behaving like an unbeliever and persists in that based upon their profession of being a believer. Church discipline is meted out. If they were to deny Christ, then we would do what? Share the gospel with them. But they continue to insist that they're a believer and live contrary to what God calls us to live. The response of the church is church discipline. Let me ask you this question. What is love? And how do you know if love is genuine? We can all agree that words alone mean very little. Love will result in action, and genuine love that can be demonstrated in many, many ways. And Jesus, of course, was the greatest example of love. God the Father sent the Son because he so loved the world of men, fallen men, that he sent his only Son to save it. And Christ being the greatest example of love, and the Apostle John tells us that he demonstrated his love through sacrifice. In 1 John chapter 4 and verses 7 through 11, John talks about what is love and how we should recognize love. Love is obeying his word, loving one another. Well, what was going on in the church of Corinth? What were the circumstances that prompted Paul's response to food sacrificed to idols? The traditional view, I believe, is correct. You can always tweak it. But the traditional view says the internal argument between the strong and the weak in the church of Corinth. And they had different ideas regarding this issue about eating meat offered to idols. One commentator said one group had no doubts about the legitimacy of eating idol meat. The other had serious reservations about it. Well, going back even further than this, Paul founded the church in Corinth in Acts, and it's recorded in Acts chapter 18 and verses 1 through 18, where he founded that church. And there he spent 18 months. There's only one other place where Paul spent more time, and that was at Ephesus. He spent 3 years at Ephesus and then 18 months at Corinth. And there's in studying 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul refers to other communication that he had with the church, which is some of the source of the not controversy, of the difficulty of understanding what's going on. Did Paul write 1 Corinthians and then did he communicate with them, and then based on that communication did he write 2 Corinthians? What's the order of all of this? That's part of what you study when you go to class about this. We spent 18 months there. Now, if you'll look back at chapter 5 and verse 9. Chapter 5 and verse 9, Paul wrote this: I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. The order is, I spent 18 months there preaching and teaching. After leaving, Paul wrote the previous letter. It says it right there in chapter 5 and verse 9. I wrote to you in my previous letter concerning eating, concerning associating with immoral people. So there, he made that warning. So he spent 18 months, and then he wrote a letter. Paul heard reports of a misunderstanding of the previous letter. Paul wrote a letter, and then he heard back that there was a misunderstanding about this previous letter. He also heard reports of disorders in the Corinthian church from the household of Chloe. And that you can see in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 11, I have been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you. So he spent 18 months, then he wrote a letter. He heard that there were misunderstandings about this previous letter, and he heard from Chloe's people that there were issues in the church at Corinth there. And it's possible at this point that he received a delegation of people from the church in Corinth the three men by the name of Stephanos, Fortuanus, and Achaeus, mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 17. It's possible that the church sent these three men to talk with Paul about some of the issues in the church. And as a result of that, he wrote what we have as 1 Corinthians. He's heard from Chloe's people, and he mentions that in chapter 1. He's written a previous letter, and he's mentioned that in chapter 5. The previous letter evidently is not inspired because it's not in the canon. So after doing this, after receiving this delegation, he wrote and sent what we have, what we know as the epistle of 1 Corinthians. And responses to these questions constitute the majority of 1 Corinthians. The things that he heard about from Chloe's people, the things that he heard about from Stephanos and Fortunatus and Archaeus and those men, he's responding to these questions, and that's why you have now concerning the things sacrificed to idols. I'm responding to a question that you have or an issue that I heard about. In chapter 7, now concerning the things about which you wrote, they wrote to him, perhaps given it to these three men, and these three men brought it to Paul. So Paul responds to these things in what we have as 1 Corinthians. Some of them are a response to the questions. Some of them are a response to what Chloe's people said about them. And he goes back and forth. So he deals with, in chapter 6, he deals with suing one another. Chapter 5, the immorality. Chapter 7, marriage. Division in chapter 1, chapter 2. Chapters 8, 9, and 10, eating idols. Chapter 11, issues around the Lord's table. Spiritual gifts in chapters 12 and 14. Resurrection in chapter 15. So he's responding to these questions and what Chloe's people have said. That's what we have here in 1 Corinthians. Now, the traditional view says that what's going on here is a disagreement between the strong and the weak. Paul never mentions the strong anywhere in chapters 8, 9, and 10, but he does mention the weak. In chapter 8 and verse 7, however, not all men have this knowledge, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. That's whom we refer to as the weak. Who are they? They are converted pagans. People who lived in Corinth, and they heard the gospel and they believed. They weren't Jews. They're not Jews. And the reason why we know that they're not Jews is you see in verse 7 where it says, being accustomed to the idol until now. That would never be a description of a Jew because the Jews abhor idols. So clearly that phrase right there refers to Gentiles, being accustomed to the idol until now. So these who are the weak, they are the converted pagans, and their past associations of the sacrificed food with pagan rites and shrines were simply too strong for them to eat in good conscience. So they did not have the strong Christians' liberating knowledge in their emotions and their sensibilities, but they felt the pressure from other people to imitate them. And not to be squeamish about this. So by caving into this pressure, the weak violated their own consciences. They ate the food, but they were not yet fully convinced that this was permissible. And Paul agreed that eating food is not a big deal offered to idols, because we know that an idol is nothing, and therefore the food is nothing. And he sides with the strong, so to speak, those who don't have a weak conscience. He sides with them, but he also gets on them because he says, you're doing this, and I understand that you have the liberty to do it because an idol is nothing. But in doing this, you're causing other believers to stumble, causing them to sin, and that's wrong. So he agreed theologically with the strong. In chapter 10, verse 19, he says, what do I mean? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, it's not. These are things that Gentiles sacrifice. They sacrifice to demons, not to God. So he sides with them, but he introduced a catch he introduced something that they failed to consider. On the one hand, Paul concurred. He agreed that they were technically correct, that consuming idol food per se was a matter of indifference for a believer. On the other hand, Paul reproached them for being insensitive. They know this, but they don't know as they ought to know. And that comes out in verse 2. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. He's talking about them. You have knowledge, but your knowledge is void of love, and that's the issue. They do not love, and consequently, they bully, in a sense, other Christian brothers and sisters, still influenced emotionally by years of conditioning regarding the temples and the other gods. That's what is taking place here. And we'll make distinctions and we'll give details as we work our way through here to understand this as best we can. Paul says here, the strong are not entirely free until they are free to forego the exercise of their freedom for the sake of others. Regarding the material, that's in response to Chloe's people, what he heard, and in response to the three men bringing the questions. There are ways of discerning what material Paul is responding to. For example, the material that we read in 1 Corinthians, which is a response to Chloe's people, the oral reports from Chloe's people, Paul usually initiates the issue. He initiates the issue. You will not see, concerning Chloe's people, what the information they brought, you will not see now concerning things sacrificed to idols. Paul's responding to a question there in chapter 7, where he says essentially the same thing. Now, concerning the things about which he wrote, these are questions. But when he responds to the news brought by Chloe's people, it's a little bit different temper. It's a little bit different tone. When he responds to Chloe's people, Paul initiates the issue. His tone is more emphatic. He's irritated by what is taking place. And he expresses the issue more sharply when he has to bring a matter to their attention. You can see that in chapter 1. In chapter 1, I exhort you, brethren, by the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree and that there be no divisions among you. And he goes on and talks about this division because of what he heard well into chapter 2. But he initiates that. So chapter 1, verse 10, all the way through chapter 4, verse 21, is talking about the discord or the splits and the ministry of Paul and Apollos. The material which replies to the questions from Corinth by letter, Paul's tone is calmer, he is gentler, he's much more reasoned, he's more at pains to present both sides of the issue. Most of the times where you can tell Paul is responding to questions, you would see things like we just saw in chapter 7, verse 1. In chapter 8 and verse 1, you see it there as well. Other places you would see that would be chapter 7, verse 25. So chapter 7, verse 1, concerning the things about which he wrote, it's good for a man that he not touch a woman. Verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. there you know that he is dealing with questions. Chapter 8, verse 1, we know about that one. Chapter 12, verse 1, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren. So he's saying, next question. Okay, it's a question about the spiritual gifts. And so he turns to his parchment and writes, now concerning spiritual gifts. Chapter 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints. So all of those are really good signs that tell us that Paul is responding to questions that were sent to him. So as we come to chapter 8, as we look at chapter 8, it's a new topic. Now concerning the things sacrificed to idols, he's addressing the next question on the card that he's been sent. So it's a new topic within the flow of the letter, and the new topic comes in the form of an answer to another one of the questions asked by the Corinthian believers, most likely asked in a previous letter they have written to Paul. And to make best sense of this argument, we should assume that Paul is citing their letter at several points. At several points, Paul will be citing their letter, specifically in verse 4. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols. So he's beginning to address that very specifically there. Probably the best thing now to do is just read read chapter 8, and then we can go through and see what Paul is saying here. Concerning the things sacrificed to idols, we know that we have knowledge. We all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God and Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. However, this is key here, not all men have this knowledge. There's your weak ones. Not all men know this. But some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food will not commend us to God. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. But take care of this liberty of yours, that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you who have knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And that's a biggie there. And so, by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. This partaking of food that he's referring to here, most likely it was done within the pagan temples themselves, that is contrary to the traditional thought. The traditional thought is that people would go to the marketplaces because certain people would get a portion of the sacrificed meat, the priest would get another portion of the sacrificed meat, and then the rest of it would go to the marketplace, to the agora, and it would be sold there. And that's where the traditional thought is there people are going to the agora and they're buying this and causing other people seeing this to struggle and to sin. But more likely it's people eating within the pagan temples themselves. Paul clearly addresses this in a very direct manner. In chapter 10, verses 1 through 22, in fact, this whole section right here takes up the entire issue against the Corinthian position that they have the right to continue eating this food in this manner. They might be insisting on their rights to do so, and Paul is trying to temper this. saying on the one hand, I know you have the right and that you have the liberty and an idol is nothing. On the other hand, you should have a greater concern, a greater love for your brethren because they do not understand what you understand. Chapters 8 through 10 takes up the entire issue of this position. The traditional view of this referring to idol food being sold in the marketplace is not addressed until chapter 10 and verse 23. The food being eaten from the marketplace is an issue. Paul brings it up, but not until chapter 10 and verses 23 and following. Because this is the case, as well as the immediate context here, chapter 8, verse 10, it only furthers the support for this to be in response to the actual eating of these foods within the temple themselves. It was the food that was left over from the God's table that was sold in the marketplace. And some people would say that's what people are responding to. I think it's better to understand that people are responding to them actually eating in the temple precincts, continuing to do that rather than buying the meat in the marketplace. So here's the big idea. Big idea for chapter 8. Mature believers should be willing to give up their freedoms in order to build up brothers and sisters who have lesser knowledge or with weaker consciences. And we'll address briefly what the conscience is, because it's not a reliable guide unless it's trained well. In 1 Corinthians 8, this chapter contains an important principle. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. So Paul was not anti-knowledge. He was not pro-ignorance. He highlighted the importance of knowledge throughout 1 Corinthians. He was saying that knowledge alone about Christian liberty, apart from love, makes a person arrogant. And as we look through some of these principles, you can think about so many things. Movies, alcohol, tobacco. It's almost endless in this culture in which we live. Who do you have your money invested in? Well, I'm invested in that company, and that company supports Planned Parenthood. Therefore, where are you going to stop? Verse 1, the Corinthians claim to have some kind of superior knowledge regarding their involvement with things sacrificed to idols, especially the eating of meat. The kind of knowledge, that kind of knowledge puffs up, and therefore Paul had to address the issue here. So what we have is a knowledge versus love, first of all. Knowledge versus love. Knowledge by itself, Paul says in verse 1, we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant. Knowledge by itself makes arrogant. And the term there, the words there signify being inflated or swollen with pride or arrogance, to be vain or conceited. Knowledge without love was a cause of pride among the members of the church at Corinth. It also says in verse 2 that knowledge alone is incomplete. He says in verse 2, if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he is not yet known as he ought to know. It's incomplete. There seemed to be confusion on the Corinthians' part in their thought, that other believers would be built up because of their knowledge. I know we have knowledge, and I need to exercise that knowledge because that's truth. And if I exercise it, other people will be encouraged and they will follow my example. That seemed to be in their head that this would happen because of their knowledge. And this is where Paul turns on them. Not only does knowledge not build up, but it puffs up the individual and it destroys others. Look down at verse 11. For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. So when we look at knowledge versus love, knowledge by itself makes arrogant and it's incomplete. That's his thesis in the first 3 verses there so far. Love, he says, edifies. That's a term that we use in church. I don't know that, have you ever used that term edify? You go back to work and you talk to your cubicle buddy after you read something. This sure was edifying. Would you like to read this? They would probably look at you and say, what? Huh? Do? We don't use the word edify. It means to build up, to strengthen. Love builds up and it strengthens. It is love which enables the Christian to employ his knowledge correctly. Knowledge alone is arrogant, it's incomplete, but love with knowledge, that knowledge is applied correctly. It is a love that brings a discernment and maturity to the knowledge that is held. Paul stated this in Philippians 2. Consider others as more important than yourself. When you adopt that, you get out of your routine, you get out of your normal pace of life, and you start thinking about others, and you begin to consider things that you had not considered before. It edifies and it works to strengthen another's spiritual life and to protect it from danger, in particularly sin. Verse 3 says that love is to be directed toward God. Where he writes, if anyone loves God, he is known by him. The second part of verse 3 there results in a true knowledge, the father-child relationship between the creature and the Creator. See, true knowledge consists not in the accumulation of so much data, nor even in the correctness of one's theology, but in the fact that one has learned to live in love toward all. Of course, love needs to be guided by the knowledge, for sure, and knowledge needs to be guided by love. Love, when it has no boundaries, when it is not informed by good theology, love has to be guided by knowledge, and that knowledge has to be guided by love. Verse 4 gets more to the point. There you have in verse 4, true gods versus false gods. So we have knowledge versus love, and now true gods versus false gods. First of all, idols. Idols are not real, verse 4. The main idea is that there is no such thing as an idol in the whole world of realities. Now, Paul does say, even if there are so-called gods in verse 5, there are many, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. In the minds of the people, there are many gods and many lords. The Old Testament admits God is the God among all the gods. The psalm we read this morning, Psalm 138, mentioned God is the God among all the gods. Well, there are no gods, but pagans do recognize that they're all gods. And so Jewish writers, knowing this, would exalt the true God over all the other gods. They could say false gods, and that would be true, but there are no other gods. These gods are not real, verse 4. They are only called gods, the first part of verse 5. These words mean so-called gods, reputed gods. They are so called because they do not have existence in the form their worshipers believe them to have. And the last part of verse 5, there are many of them in number. Many of them. All you have to do is be slightly familiar with Greek mythology. Oh my word, many of them. And there are many more in other religions of the world. So from idols, the true God versus false God. Paul says in the second part of verse 4, he says, is the one and only real and true God. And then in the first part of verse 6, yet for us there is but one, or there is one God. In verse 6, there's a strong contrast. When he says yet, that's very strong contrast. It's used here to denote a strong antithesis. But to us, and it's in an emphatic position, the God of the Christians is sharply contrasted with the gods of the heathen. This one true God, in the last part of verse 6, it says, He is Father. He is the source and the creator of all. And man exists for the purpose of serving and glorifying this God. The very last part of verse 6, it says that He is the Lord Jesus Christ. Through Him were all things created, and we were created through Him. Paul takes these first six verses to establish that there is knowledge and then there is love, and the distinction between them. There are false gods and then there is the true God. Having established that, verse 7 and following, verse 7 through the remainder of the chapter, he begins again with a strong contrast in verse 7. However, it's the same Greek word that you see in verse 6. So there is a strong antithesis there. The tradition is valid, but its application has to be qualified and modified in the light of the comfortable sensitivities on the part of those who are perceived as weak. In other words, those who are not weak need to make a change. Here in verses 7 and following is detail, in principle, what he said in verses 1, 2, and 3. It's detail in principle what he said in verses 1, 2, and 3. That love, not knowledge, builds up, and therefore love is what true knowledge is all about. Paul has already established in verses 4 through 6 that despite the fact that idols do not really exist as gods, for them, pagans, there are many gods and many lords. What does he do now? Now in verse 7 and following, Paul asserts that not all men have this knowledge. He's established that there is love and there is knowledge. There are true gods and there are false gods, but not all men understand that. Not all men have this. Some men were raised up in these pagan temples, and that's all they did all their life. And they have not been able to separate and understand this meat offered to idols really means nothing to them. And very likely, when you became a believer, there were some things in your life that you immediately jettisoned and you don't want to go back to because it reminds you of the former life. Or if it's too much of a temptation for you to start thinking about what you used to do or something. And so you stayed away from it, which is wise. But now you have a little bit of an understanding of what Paul is dealing with here, something like that. Some men lack discerning knowledge regarding eating of food sacrificed to idols. That's what he says in the first part of verse 7. And that directly contradicts the claim of the enlightened Corinthians, which Paul mentioned in verse 1. Probably verse 1 is a quote from them or a summary statement of their position. Concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. You've talked to me about your knowledge that you have, and you're exercising your knowledge, and you're living according to your knowledge. I know that we all have knowledge. So likely Paul is responding to something to them. And what he begins to talk about is their spiritual state and the result of that. So the last part of verse 7, where he says, if it were sacrificed to an idol and their conscience being weak is defiled, their spiritual state and result is this, a weak conscience. That is, being intimate with and having had a habitual contact with is what that means. It is the force of habit that still grips them when they eat such meat. They eat it as an idol sacrifice, though they no longer believe in idols. There's a hangover. There's an anthropological hangover. How's that? In their life. The old man hangover that's still there, and it's still very sensitive, and it still reminds them too much. There's an anthropological hangover. This idol taint clings in their minds, and it clings to this meat. And you guys that have knowledge of this, you need to add love to it and consider your brother as more important and understand what's going on in his life and do what's best for him. But by plowing ahead and doing what you're doing, verse 11, you are ruining a brother, this one for whom Christ died, for whose sake Christ died. Their weak conscience. Their conscience is defiled, it says in verse 7. Now, here's a little bit about conscience. Conscience doesn't actually teach us what is right and wrong. What the conscience does is it urges us to do what we have been taught is right. Best illustration that I've heard was in the book by MacArthur called, years ago he wrote a book called The Vanishing Conscience. And he compared it to skylight. Skylights, as long as you keep them clean, it allows a certain measure of, or a certain degree of light to come through, and it influences. But if you do not clean it, it becomes muddy, it becomes dull, less and less light come into that life, less and less that you see. Translation, if you teach children well, their conscience will react to that. Their conscience will become sensitive to what you teach them, and they will instinctively know by virtue of the law written on their heart, Romans 2, and by virtue of you teaching them that taking somebody else's toy is wrong or lying is wrong. But if you do not teach them well, that skylight becomes dull, not much light comes in, there's no reaction. They push and they hit and they lie and they kick and they shoot and they kill. And there's no internal reaction, no reflex internally, no conscience. So the conscience does not actually teach us what is right and wrong, but it urges us to do what we have been taught. That's why it's important to teach children well. You shape that conscience. You make that conscience sensitive to the truth. And perhaps, of course, the Lord can take a very dull conscience and turn it around, no doubt. But our desire, of course, is to see salvation. The very least of our desire is to see children responding to what is good and what is right. Don't lie. Don't take what's not yours. Be kind to one another. These Corinthians believed that something was a sin even though it was not really a sin. That is, these weak people, the weak ones. But at their point of understanding, experience, and the maturity, it was their belief that this activity was sinful and they should not do it. They should not do it, and yet they saw others do it. And perhaps they went and did it themselves and violated their own conscience. So Paul's conclusion to this in verse 8, he says, but food will not commend us to God. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. Food does not bring grace from God. We cannot lose grace based upon our eating customs or our eating habits. If idols are nothing, then they can do nothing to the meat, correct? Holding some meat in front of a piece of wood or stone does not change the nutritional value of the meat or defile it in any way. Therefore, the meat could certainly be eaten by a Christian without having any adverse effect. There's a common misconception about freedom. People think if I am free to do something, then I must do that thing. I must assert my freedom and do the thing in order to be truly free. But this makes a Christian into a slave to his own freedom. In this verse, Paul had just said that exercising our freedom does not commend us to God in any way, and that refraining from exercising our freedom does not hurt us in any way. So it's just as much an exercise of Christian liberty to not eat meat as it is to eat the meat. So we say, you have the freedom to do that. Yes, you also have the freedom not to do it. And verse 9 is his main point. Main point, verse 9. He says, but take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Take care that this liberty, this eating the meat sacrificed to idols, that it becomes a stumbling block. Take care means to look out, to watch out for. And notice that it is addressed to the mature believers and not to the immature. There's no command here from God for the immature believers to grow up. Come on, get with the program. Grow up. Nothing here. Just I was thinking about, today I was thinking about, of all things, cutting wood. Splitting wood. It's the responsibility of the person swinging the maul to make sure that nobody is around him so that they can get hurt. That's his responsibility. The mature, the one who can swing the axe, has the responsibility to make sure the little ones are away. Not the little ones have the responsibility to stay out of the way of the man, of the one swinging the axe. So there's no command to grow up here. It's addressed to the mature believers. Do not be immature. Why? Why is this important? Verse 11, it ruins the brother. It ruins the sister. Verse 12, it is a sin against Christ. So Paul's response in verse 13, I will never eat meat if it causes a brother to stumble. The principle here is, I think, relatively simple. Love trumps liberty. Take care how you use your liberty around someone who might be weak, someone who might not understand what is taking place. And in my own life, people have been very good about that. We've been invited to people's houses when the kids were smaller, and they've asked, would it be okay if we had a glass of wine at the meal? And I thank them. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate you asking that. At this point, I would ask you not to do that, because don't want to expose them to that. Don't want to have that conversation yet. Okay. And but they were thinking ahead of what the possibilities might be. And that's where we have to get out of stop being so selfish about stuff. We have to start thinking, what is the impact? What is somebody going to think if they see me doing this? Or if they come over my house and see something, what will they think? Be wise. Be discreet. That's what we need. We need to do that more and more. And when people are that way, I'm very appreciative of it. So the principle, love trumps liberty. Take care how you use your liberty around someone. You don't know what the reaction may be. You don't know what the effect might be. Someone who believes it is a sin to eat meat sacrificed to idols. There might be something like that. Misusing liberty can ruin a brother in Christ, verse 11, and that would be tragic. That would be sin on your part before God. And here's some questions that may help you decide whether or not to engage in an activity. These are just some bullet point things. Is this activity helpful and profitable, or is it something non-essential that is really not important to my life? I'm just do this. It's fun. It would be fun, but maybe wouldn't be. The impact on other people or whatever. That's the question to ask. Is this activity helpful or profitable, or is it something non-essential that is really not really important to my life? Here's another one. Does this activity promote or support what is good, right, and true according to God's standards? Obvious things that are obvious come to mind. Getting drunk, obviously, no. That scripture already says that clearly. So those obvious examples, illustrations, are we're not talking about that. We're talking about, is it okay for me to have a glass of wine at my table with my neighbor and they know I'm a believer? What would be the potential impact of that? Not going to do it. Don't want to risk it. Not the best thing. That kind of thing. Another question would be this: is this activity something that would be a good example of behavior for other Christians to imitate? Another one: if my unsaved friends saw me doing this activity, would it lead them closer to trusting Christ, or would it show that Christ does not really make a difference in my life? Will this activity help me and others around me to become more mature spiritually? Last one here. If I engage in this activity, can I be sure that some other believer will not be harmed by following my example? Those are all just potential questions to think about. And 3 points of application. Our choices and our behavior should be motivated and characterized by self-sacrificing love for those around us, rather than by knowledge alone. Another application. This passage here points out that even godly believers can believe things that are not true. This fact leads us to see the importance of continually teaching the truths of God's Word to others so that we may all grow up in maturity in our faith. Third principle, last principle. Believers should be careful how we behave. It is possible that our conduct might lead other believers to violate their own consciences and incur sin, and we would incur sin. We are accountable to God to set a good example, and this should include self-denial from certain things for the sake of others. A phrase that you hear thrown around is, avoid the appearance of evil. You need to look at the context of that, because people use that. That's one of those passages that people use out of context fairly often. I want to avoid the appearance of evil. Again, look at the context and see what he's talking about. Well, I went into this restaurant that also has a bar. I would never go there. I don't want to give off the appearance of evil. I don't want to influence anybody. Maybe so, but don't use that passage. So as we grow in the knowledge of our understanding, knowledge of God's Word, some of these things that get taken out of context, at times they get placed in their proper context, and then we have greater knowledge. And then it's incumbent upon us to mix love in there, to use that knowledge for God's glory. And that would be for the building up, strengthening of believers around us. Any questions?